This is Cancer Chronicles, Journeys of Resilience, Tenacity, and Hope. I'm Scott Gurian. If you've listened to the last 7 episodes of our podcast, you know that the Rutgers Cancer Institute held a series of storytelling workshops last fall with the help of the New Brunswick, New Jersey-based nonprofit arts organization Collab Arts. Last December, they organized a public Story Slam event. So far on our show, we've featured the participants from that event sharing their stories and discussing how cancer has impacted them and their loved ones. Today, on our final episode, we're going to peek behind the curtain and tell you the story of how this Story Slam came about. The storytellers you've heard in this series may have sounded like well-polished professionals, but in truth, it was a long journey from when they showed up at that first meeting back in August of last year until they were ready to go up on stage for their live performance. In between, there were a bunch of training workshops and dress rehearsals where they were led step by step through the process of selecting a story and then refining it to make it as interesting and impactful as possible. In a moment, we'll delve into the details of just how that training took place. But first, there's a more central question we want to answer, which is why this whole event happened in the first place. John Keller is Collab Arts' Director of Education and Outreach. As he explained to participants at the first storytelling workshop, stories aren't just for children.
The guiding force that unites communities, that unites individuals, that unites groups of people, that unites ideas is storytelling. Good quality storytelling. The ability to share a clear, concise articulation of what is going on in our lives, what is going on in our work, why it matters, right? In the business of adult life, we forget sometimes the simplicity and the specificity of being able to share those kinds of ideas. That's why we're here.
Dusty Ballard was one of the team leaders who helped run the storytelling trainings, and he agreed.
Every single part of our day is somehow connected to storytelling. All of you have done job interviews. Job interviews are where you sit in front of other people and tell stories about your life. When you go to the water cooler, all you're doing is sharing stories about either last night or this weekend or something. The way we connect with humans in this world that we have is through stories, especially in a healthcare circumstance. Stories are everything. I mean, the amount of times that we're sitting and listening to people share stories so that we can better understand them. There are just countless examples of that. And if you are coming from the world of research, even more so, I would say, because the amount of trying to get someone else who isn't you to understand sort of the trajectory of what has been discovered very delicately is a real job.
And what about the participants themselves? Why did they think it was important to take part? Sarah Scharf is the executive director of the Rutgers Cancer Institute's Cancer Health Equity Center of Excellence, and she said she hoped that putting herself out there might be beneficial to others.
You know, to be quite honest, I was reluctant. I was really nervous. But in the end, I really wanted to share my story because I strongly feel that many others have a similar situation, and by sharing my story will help hopefully increase awareness on the importance of talking to your family members about cancer and getting screened, and also learning about your risk and getting genetic testing, because the more information you have, the better you can learn about different treatment options and possibly prevention.
For Nan Stroop, who's director of the New Jersey State Cancer Registry, it was all about making her scientific work relatable to the layperson.
I think my primary interest was to learn how to convey a story that would capture interest from, just the community in general about the kind of research that I do. I'm a cancer epidemiologist, so I deal with a lot of data. And that doesn't always translate into easy conversations with the community or people in other fields. So I thought storytelling would help me build that skill set.
Whatever people's personal motivations are, Dusty Ballard says that from his perspective leading storytelling trainings, there are a few key recipes for success.
The thing I think I'm always looking for in a storyteller is their curiosity about themselves and about their experience. And also if the experience they're talking about is far enough away from like their present self that they can actually kind of look at it in a slightly objective way. Because if it's something you've experienced, there's no real way to be totally objective about it. We're always going to be subjective in some way. But if we're able to have enough space so that it's like this present moment, we're not still in the middle of that story, then I think we've got something.
So where to begin? Well, in the very first workshop, John Keller started off by dispelling the myth that effective storytelling is all about talent.
Does anyone here have someone in their life that they think, oh, wow, that person's a really good storyteller? They must have just been born with it. Wrong. They learned it somewhere. And they learned a structure somewhere. Whether they could tell you what that structure is or not, they learned it. It's ingrained to them. Part of what we're going to do today is say there's a technique that you can incorporate at any point, right? You can actually build a structure.
And the initial foundation of that structure, he explained, is connecting with your listeners.
The first thing you want to do is make yourself look like a human being. When we think about relatable openings, we think sometimes it's like, what are the most relatable things about us? Usually our flaws. Usually the things that make us a little vulnerable, right? The audience wants to root for us. We have to just figure out a way to kind of relate to them in some simple way. We haven't experienced your story, but if we feel we're on your side, we can experience it with you.
Once participants choose a story to tell, one challenge, Dusty says, is teaching them to describe scenes using vivid and colorful language to make their stories come alive.
Usually we'll do some kind of like free write situation where I'm like, take a piece of paper, use it however you want, and just write down a bunch of details all over the page that you remember. And then in the next phase of that, we actually draw a picture where you draw yourself at the center, and then you think about like the most memorable moment, and then you draw the rest of what's around you during that moment. And the reason that I do that is it activates the other side of the brain, because we can very much think like very kind of orderly about things on the left side, and then that gets our right side going so that we remember the things like the smells and the colors of things and the textures of things and the way that that shirt felt sitting on us if we were sweating really hard in that moment. All of those details come back when we think about it from the other side of our brain.
Memorable stories also need to have a moment of tension, which raises the stakes for the audience. And, said team leader Christina Briskin, their chain of events should have a clear direction.
So really you want to think about in your story, as you're coming through that sequence of action, that piece that's the climax, where you defeat the conflict or the conflict defeats you. I like to say it's the point of no return, right? Once you go past that point in the story, it is never going to go back to what it was. And then what's your clear ending line? You are different, or the world is different. What does that look like?
The mechanics of structuring a good story might sound pretty straightforward or even scientific in nature, but being a storyteller, especially when it involves such intimate details as a cancer diagnosis, can be fraught with emotion. So Jasmine Carmichael, another one of the team leaders, calmed people's nerves by leading the group in a moment of meditation.
And we're just going to take some deep breaths together, remembering that there is no judgment, there is no expectation. All there is a story, your story, and this community of people who are here to support, encourage, and truly listen.
Still, for newcomers who had never done this before, the thought of telling a personal story before a crowd was initially a bit intimidating. Here's a recording we made of one of those early training sessions where Raven Prophet, a data analyst at the Rutgers Cancer Institute, expressed her skepticism.
Are we going to share it?
Are you comfortable? Sure, we would love to hear your story.
Let me put it this way. Instead of saying comfortable, is it an appropriate level of discomfort? Is it the learning edge of discomfort?
It's very uncomfortable, actually.
I spoke to Raven afterward and asked her to describe what this moment was like.
I'm really reserved, and I don't really like sharing intimate details about my story sometimes. So that was really hard for me, but after hearing everyone else share their own stories and then getting the feedback from just people who attended, it felt like people were receptive to it.
So by the end of the training, she felt totally different.
This was so powerful. I'm so happy I came.
Me too.
And this was so healing for me. Like, I came in with the mindset, like, I don't want to share. But thank you.
Sarah Scharf, who we heard from earlier, also started out feeling like Raven. In fact, when the workshop leaders asked her to give some feedback, she told them at first that she felt like she wanted to go hide somewhere. But her thinking evolved as well.
You know, public speaking in general is always something that is hard because you have to be vulnerable in front of a lot of people. Whether you're sharing something that you're an expert in and you feel confident, it's a little bit different than getting up there and sharing something personal that is your story, because there's typically emotions behind it. So being brave, I hope, would inspire others to do the same. But also it was a healing process for me too, because I feel now more equipped in being able to share that story on a day-to-day basis, and also knowing how important it was hearing from people afterwards on sharing that story.
I also spoke after the event with Tamara Horn, who runs administrative services at the Cancer Institute. I listened back to the recording of you telling your story first at the dress rehearsal and then at the final event, and the difference was amazing. Like, from the moment the words first came out of your mouth, like, I immediately noticed, that the beginning of your story was a lot stronger. You sounded way more confident. What was that whole experience of learning to be a storyteller like for you?
Yeah, so I guess what happened between dress rehearsal and the actual time of on stage is that my folks were in the audience. So I just kind of wanted to make everybody proud and not mess up in any kind of way. So I know I was really preparing myself mentally, just get in the zone as best as possible, and hopefully touch the hearts of others who, maybe have lost a loved one through cancer. So yeah, being up on stage, I mean, I've been on stage, but not for that. It was a relief to get through it, and it was a joy to do it and to see smiles and to hear people talk about, they really connected with my story. And for the most part, yes, I'm proud of it, and I know my family was proud of me.
Dr. Shuchi Dutta is a faculty member with the Cancer Institute and the Rutgers Institute for Quantitative Biomedicine. She said the storytelling training she attended helped her give more thought to how she'll convey complicated information in the future.
The very first workshop I had gone into, they said the story is yours and the structure is what we will try to give you. And I think that turned out to be very true. I have learned to appreciate that when the content and the structure are appropriately aligned, you can actually create a very impactful product. And I felt that through the workshops and the iterative guidance and editing and suggestions and so on that we had over the multiple sessions, I learned how to sort of pick out the key points that I was trying to make, like where was the story going, like what is the main message, and how sometimes details that are very personal or appear to be very important may or may not be relevant to that message, and so they could probably be left out, and certain other things probably should be given more time and importance. And so that structure, that guidance and that suggestion, it actually, I think, helped me get across the point that I was trying to make.
You might remember that Dr. Dutta told the story about how she and her sister tried to make sense of the medical jargon in the doctor's reports after their father was diagnosed with leukemia. She said she found the storytelling process very therapeutic.
As I was writing the story, I went back and I reviewed all the texts that my sister and I had exchanged during that process. So while I was living through that, I had certain emotions, I had certain frustrations, anxieties, so on and so forth. In the process of writing this story, I actually went through those texts a couple of times. The first time, I think it reminded me of that pain and anxiety. After the second and third time, I could sort of step back and look at the whole thing in a slightly distant way. And then I started seeing that, oh, these are the things that probably many others experience. So I had sort of dissociated my personal feelings from those exchanges. And so I think that it helped me put a little bit of perspective on all that experience that I went through. And it also sort of enforced the idea that there is room for improvement here and here and here, that I need to come back. And it's not something that I can do in one go or 5 minutes or 1 hour. In fact, I feel like I want to dedicate a significant part of my efforts in the future in trying to bridge these gaps. So for others who are facing a diagnosis or have a loved one who has such a diagnosis, they can get a little bit more understanding of what is going on and feel a little bit more prepared for what to expect and how to navigate through all that.
Dusty Ballard says that for many participants, the experience of taking part in the Story Slam is transformative.
Every single time we go through this process of crafting an evening of live stories, people always surprise themselves. They don't realize how, in a way, it's like you're nourishing yourself by standing in front of a group of people and telling people your truth. And it is like spilling your guts up there at a microphone in front of others. And I just find that people often, they stand a little differently when they're done telling a story in front of a group of people, and then they have to walk out into the lobby and say hello to everyone else. You could call it another layer of confidence, another layer of self-belief, but there is definitely something left and something added to sort of just their own personal disposition when they are done telling a story in front of other people.
That certainly rang true for Nicole Etienne, who's a marketing coordinator with the Cancer Institute's Cancer Health Equity team. She said this whole process helped her realize that her perspective was more valuable than she thought.
It's crazy because I didn't think I had a story to tell. And then as I'm working through the workshops, I'm realizing, wow, it wasn't just my mom, my grandparents both had cancer. My friend had breast cancer. So it really started making me think about this bigger conversation about cancer and all the different people who are in my life who've been touched by cancer, and then flushing out the story that I felt was the most impactful, which was obviously the one with my mom. And my goal in the storytelling workshop was to take a horrible event and at the end have somebody laugh. And it worked. After my story, so many people came up to me and were like, oh my God, you really touched me. You know, you really got me with your story. And it helped me, especially as a marketing person, on how I would go forward framing marketing materials, brochures, postcards, and making them more relatable and personable, and saying that, you know, they need to have more of a human touch. A lot of times our medical materials are so clinical and so sterile that they scare people off, and cancer is already scary. And so just having that mind of a storyteller's point of view where you can make it something that hits them here in their heart or in their spirit and pushes them past the fear to action, to get screened, to go to that doctor's appointment. That was an impact and a residual from the storytelling process for me.
Dr. Dutta said she was also surprised at the response she received from members of the audience.
I had people walk up to me and talk about how storytelling can be a very powerful medium for really understanding what community members are experiencing. So the person who walked up to me was sort of an intermediary between her community, which was the Latinx community, and clinicians. And she said that a lot of times it's very difficult to explain to a clinician some cultural aspects or some social aspects that may have a huge impact on the clinical outcome. It's not a box in any form or a checklist where you can say this is happening to me or this is not happening to me. So it's not perhaps accounted for in developing the treatment plan. And if that point was addressed or understood, perhaps the outcomes could be different because the treatment could be different. And these were her words. She said that through stories, people could narrate what those social, cultural factors were. I thought that that was a very powerful way that stories can have a very big impact.
And that wraps up our series. Cancer Chronicles is a project of the Rutgers Cancer Institute through a cross-department collaboration between the Cancer Health Equity Center of Excellence, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and Cancer Research Education and Training. To learn more about the Cancer Institute's work, visit them on the web at cinj.org. This podcast series was produced by me, Scott Gurian, and the executive producers were Dan Swern and John Keller of Collab Arts, which engages artists, social advocates, and communities to create transformative new work. You can find out more about them at collab-arts.org. Our theme music was composed by Dave Seaman. Thanks so much for listening.